Welcome, patrons, and thank you once again, sincerely, for being patrons. This is another exclusive for your eyes only, and it's another incomplete story by M.R. James. Written, I don't know, it seems it's probably an early story that kind of didn't make it into his first collection, Ghost Stories and Antiquary. Anyway, it is called Speaker Lenthal's Tomb. 50 years carries us back to the times of the Oxford movement, the first rage of the Gothic revival, and the restorations of many of the finest churches in England, restorations whose results were often of the most deplorable kind. Pugin was at the head of the Gothicists. Wales, Willimant and Hardman were trying their prentice hands upon the rediscovery of the art of glass painting with very indifferent success. Newman had joined the Roman Church, and many other interesting names are in men's mouths, of which I could tell you more if I happened to know anything about them. Now, among the many beautiful country towns in the south of England, few are more complete or fascinating than Burford in Oxfordshire. It's very much out of the world. There's hardly a new house in it, and there are several exceptionally fine old ones, as well as magnificent parish church. Now, to Burford it was that Cromwell's speaker Lenthall retired. There he built his beautiful house, which is now almost a ruin, and there he died and was buried. His house must be very shortly described. It is of stone with a surprisingly rich front and a chapel attached thereto by a covered walk, possessing one of the last rose windows ever made in England before this century. Texts are carved and painted on the walls, and there are indications that the fittings must at one time have been sumptuous, but the roof is gone, and the place today is but a shattered ruin. 50 years ago, things weren't quite so bad, although even then the chapel had been long disused. The house was inhabited then, was perfectly sound and well furnished, even to richness. It had passed away from the Lenthals to the not less ancient and reputable line of the Claxtons, a once considerable people in Suffolk. But they too had left off living there, and it was now held on lease by a rich clergyman, Mr. Cave, who, in the evening of his days, had retired from active duty and brought his family and his library to Burford, where he found existence tolerable enough. A rich clergyman, as I said, and one considerably learned in ancient matters and with a strong turn for Gothic architecture, as it was then understood. What was more natural then that he should work upon the feelings of the rector, who was an old friend, and lead a subscription list for the restoring of St. Mary's Church, Burford. Now, he'd been little more than a year in the place when the movement was started, and now we find Mr. Cave, young Mr. Edward Cave, Miss Mary Cave, Mr. Eldon the rector, and Mr. Green the architect, he was a disciple of Pugin's, conferring upon the necessary alterations after dinner and a long day spent in and about the church. The galleries and pews must go, Eldon. That's clear enough, said Cave Senior. And the organ shift into the north transept. I do wish we could get rid of that hideous erection of Speaker Lenthal's. It fills up the whole of the north choir aisle, and we might have arranged such a pretty little morning chapel there for the daily service. Now, the erection alluded to is indeed large, but of alabaster and other marbles, and we do not today call it hideous. It's covered with emblematical statues of virtues and arts, and it is really rather imposing. Ah, yes, indeed, said the rector. That is a block, to be sure. Utterly miserable work, isn't it? One wonders what, in any age, it could have been thought to possess the least merit. Well, can nothing be done? Could you get a faculty or whatever it is to remove it? This was Edward Cave, aged some 23, and then at Trinity College, Oxford. Ah, well, my dear sir, the faculty might be off easily enough, said Mr. Green, the architect. The only question is, are there any surviving relatives of Speaker Lenthal? And can their consent to the removal of the monument be obtained? If so, then all is easy. Really? Well, that sounds promising, doesn't it? I mean, there can't be any Lenthals left, can there, Father? Oh, ask the rector, my boy. I should hardly imagine it. Well, actually, said the rector, yeah, we do still have a Lenthal in Burford, in the almshouse, but she's nearer 90 than 80, and it has been ascertained, I believe with certainty, that she is the last of the name. I mean, one can hardly doubt that a £5 note would be more an object to her than a hideous pile of alabaster. Well, are you clear then, Green, that we must get this lady's consent to the removal? Said Mr. Cave. Yes, Mr. Cave. Yes, if there are any survivors, then their written consent must be obtained. The law is very clear on that point. Well, look, even if there was to be any difficulty, I mean, we could easily wait for the sands to run down, couldn't we? I mean, it can't in nature be long before the poor old thing's out of the way for good. Well, Cave, said the rector, I fancy you might actually have some time to wait if you put off the matter till she's dead. No, I mean, she's as upright as a dart, and certainly she has a will of her own. No, I propose that Green and you and Harry and I go down in force tomorrow morning and call on Mrs. Elizabeth Lenthal with a document ready prepared to which she can set her name. Green can bring his drawings with him to impress the old lady with the extent of the improvement which would result from the clearing away of her ancestor's tomb. Certainly, said the architect. And if it would help matters, I could easily work some of the statuettes into the chapel somewhere. And of course, we would have a sketch done of the monument before it's taken down and a slab laid in the floor. I mean, the speaker's effigy could be kept in the vestry, couldn't it? Well, yes, said the rector. I'm sure that could be managed easily enough. But really, the whole thing is such a wretched thing that I'd sooner just make a clean sweep of it. So would I, said Mr. Green. Yes, perhaps my suggestions had better be reserved to form the basis of a compromise, if that proves necessary. What sort of person was Speaker Lenthal, Papa? This was Miss Mary Cave now. Well, was he a fine character? No, my dear, said her father. By all accounts, he was something of a trimmer in his later days, and a very hard customer in money matters. They said that he did most bitterly repent his share in King Charles's death. But you'll have to look him up in Clarendon. I'm afraid I'm no authority on the Civil War. Well, I suppose it's very bad taste on my part, said the young lady, but I must say, I've always rather admired that monument. Mary! Exclaimed her brother. That gaudy, half-classical, nondescript erection? I always thought you had some sort of perception of what was good in art. Well, Harry, I said I supposed it was my bad taste, and I dare say it is. But you must allow that the materials are rather beautiful, and the colouring and some of the modelling is very clever. Besides, I could never see the reason in refusing to admire a thing just because it's not of a particular period and style. I mean, surely there can be beautiful things made in more styles than one. I remember quite well, Harry, when you used to admire St. Paul's Cathedral tremendously before you went to Oxford. Exactly, Mary, before I went to Oxford. And before I even looked at a Gothic church, and before I'd made any attempt at educating my tastes, and before 2 or 3 other things of equal importance, perhaps I did like St. Paul's. Well, all I can say is I think differently now. Well, perhaps in 30 or 40 years, you may be able to find room to admire St. Paul's as well as Gothic churches. Anyway, I must go. Good night, Harry. And when she'd said her other good nights, Miss Cave departed, Mr. Green's eyes following her with something of pity and amusement. A declamation from Harry in the style peculiar to his university upon the wonderful character of female taste followed, which it's hardly necessary for me to report. And soon after that, the gentlemen dispersed also. Next morning, they met again at Mr. Cave's house and proceeded with drawings and documents in an imposing procession to the Burford Arms houses, founded by Speaker Lenthall's daughter, who had married a Claxton in 1695. Now, these houses are of the familiar type. A long row of cottages, 1 story high, date and inscription in a pediment in the centre, a garden behind, her house and a share in the garden and pump belonging to each inmate. Mr. Green mourned melodiously over the design of the cottages and pointed out how far preferable to this would have been a Gothic hospitium with a chapel and a statuette of a patron saint. "Well, Green," said Mr. Cave, "who knows but we may see that here yet? The endowment of this place is pretty good, and a few years' accumulation will go a long way supplying what you want. But we must wait until we've done with the church first, I think." "Here is Mrs. Lenthall's house, the one at the end," interposed the rector. "But perhaps as I be treasurer, I'd better begin the wall." Now, the old lady was a fine and dignified object as she sat in her armchair by the fire, in the white cap and blue tippet, which were de rigueur for the inheritresses of Dame Claxton's bounty. She rose on the entrance of the 4 gentlemen, and it was plain that the rector had not been exaggerating when he said that she was as upright as a dart. She had fine dark eyes, rather thick white eyebrows, and strongly cut features. The only thing that singled out the functions of her parlour was a small oval portrait of Speaker Lenthal over the mantelpiece. It was by a good hand, and it showed something of the strength of character and will which had reappeared in his descendant's face. "We have come, Mrs. Lenthal," said Mr. Green, "upon a matter of business which we hope may turn out as well to your advantage as to that of the parish at large. I think you know Mr. Cave, who lives at the Hall. This is his son, who I dare say you also know. And this is Mr. Green, the gentleman who's been good enough to undertake the important work of restoring our beautiful parish church to something of its ancient comeliness." "I'm very happy, gentlemen, to see you," said the old lady in a strong and rather masculine voice. "If you will be at pains to find chairs for yourselves, I shall be obliged to you, for I am rather past the age when bustling about suits me." Well, there was a general murmur of pray, do not think of moving, Mrs. Lenthal, and the 4 chairs were shuffled into position and occupied. "So," began the rector, "well, the fact is, Mrs. Lenthal, well, we are in a difficulty as regards the large monument to Speaker Lenthal that stands in the chancel aisle of St. Mary's. I mean, it was no doubt considered a very beautiful structure in its day, and it must have been a very costly one. But knowledge, we know, don't we, grows. And we have come to see in our more enlightened days that such memorials to the dead have much that is unsightly and unfitting about them." Mrs. Lenthal fixed her eyes upon Mr. Eldon, who coughed and went on. "Now, Mr. Green has pointed out to us that were that monument removed, we should be enabled to put up a most beautiful little chapel in which the beautiful liturgy of our church might be daily said. And he's furthermore told us that in order to be able to obtain leave from our bishop to remove the monument, we must first obtain the consent of the relations of the person who is buried there. Now, I know, because you've often told me that you are the last Lenthal now surviving, and I'm very sorry to think of it." Miss Lenthal bowed slightly. And we have made bold this morning to come and ask you if you would be so kind as to put your name to this document which we have prepared, giving your consent to the removal of the monument. Mr. Cave has been so good as to say that he will see that a sum of money should be paid to you in consideration for your goodness, and I'm confident that beyond that you will feel much satisfaction in having done a service to the parish in which you have been respected for so long. Now, if you'll think it over quietly and look at this drawing which Mr. Green has prepared, showing the proposed change, we shall be much indebted to you. Mrs. Lenthal examined the drawing for a minute or two. "'Tis your work, then, young gentleman?" she said suddenly to the architect, so suddenly that he jumped. "What? Yes, my good friend," he said on recovering his presence of mind. And you see, do you not, what a handsome chapel for matins will be the result of the destruction of that hideous pile that your ancestor erected. "That is sufficient. Thank you, kindly young man," said Mrs. Lenthal. "It is no good trade to speak of the dead in that kind. Butcher Green's bills were paid regular by my grandmother, for I have them in the chest. And Lenthal's money went some way, I reckon, to prentice Butcher Green's great-grandson to a builder." Well, there's no denying that Mr. Green was a good deal taken aback by this sally. He went a burning red colour for some minutes, and no word escaped him. The two older gentlemen were amused, if rather sorry for him, but Harry Cave, who had rather taken up the architect, was exceedingly angry. "Yes, I really think you might keep a civil tongue in your head, my good woman. We are only anxious to do our best for the church, and you have a plain question to answer, whether you object or not to Speaker Lenthal's tomb being destroyed." Mrs. Lenthal looked at him and smiled to herself, and then turning to Mr. Cave, she said, "Ah, sir, time flies, don't it? Master Harry's time for going to college will come soon, and maybe he'll turn out a sharp lad as his works yet. 'Tis not easy to tell with the young, but I warrant you he'll make a learner. But now, gentlemen, to answer you in regard of my great-grandfather's monument, I would be glad to not send you away disappointed, and yet the matter is thus. I never will give my consent, while I am a living woman, to the touching of the Speaker's tomb in Burford Church. I have lived to hear it praised for a fine piece all my days, and I cannot tell but after I go there will come those that will cry it up again. And rector, and I say this to you in all sadness, if there comes a breaking down of Lenthal tombs when I am dead, Lenthals will see to it, and trouble will be heard. For the Speaker needs to rest quiet, and the Speaker was a strong man. And I'm not very sure if Mr. Cave will not hear more of it than he thinks." Mr. Cave laughed quietly. Well, Mrs. Lenthal, I think I will take the risk of that. But Harry was still fuming, and not to be held in. "You, Madam Lenthal, may be very proud of your ancestor, the Speaker, but most of us would rather not have such an old ratter and trimmer in the family. And another thing I can tell you is that it will give me the greatest pleasure to knock that hideous tomb to bits as soon as I get the opportunity." "Sit you there a moment, Master Henry," said the old woman, whom this speech seemed to have touched very nearly. "You would say, as soon as I'm in my grave, you will knock the Speaker's tomb to bits. The tomb that he had men from Italy to make, and paid them £400 for it. You that lives in his house, and sleeps, I dare say, in his chamber. Well, you may begin it. I dare say you will, but you will not carry it through. Not one of you will go through this business, and you are well advised to look to yourself in the doing. Now, gentlemen, I wish you a good morning, for I am not well in myself, and such talk is not good for an old heart." Well, the gentlemen took back their document and their drawings and went home to the Lenthal house, and they found themselves reduced to leave the chapel out of the programme for the present. Miss Mary Cave paid a long visit to Miss Lenthal in the afternoon and reported on her return that the old lady seemed very weak and was still much incensed against Harry. That was on a Thursday in March. On Saturday, Mrs. Lenthal died, and on Monday she was buried. Harry's spirits were only superficially damped because he went back to Oxford for the Easter term, and the designs of the new chapel were completed by Mr. Green. But it is now the long vacation. The faculty for the removal of Lenthal's tomb has arrived, and Harry himself is to superintend the destruction of that abomination of desolation. Miss Cave is still regretful, and so are some of the inhabitants of Burford. Several farmers have driven their wives in to see the last of the monument, and Mr. Green has made a sketch of it with a good deal of inaccuracy, and he succeeded in making it appear as ugly and clumsy as he believed it to be. But enough. The fated morning arrived. Harry and the workmen were around the monument, selecting the best point of attack. The headman suggested that the best way would be to get out one of the corner columns supporting the canopy, and then the canopy would fall and help to break up the effigy and the actual tomb below. So Harry was just loosening the base of the said column with the thin end of a mattock when, smash, down came the statuette of Envy, which stood at the top of it, entwined with snakes, and took him on the shoulder in its descent. Now he could not raise himself, and he had to be helped up in a good deal of pain. His collarbone was broken, and he had a deep cut on the side of his head. No more mason's work for Harry at the moment, was the doctor's verdict, and someone gave him an arm home. The masons, meanwhile, were examining the place whence the figure had fallen. It was curious, I said, that it should have come down like that, because it was fixed on a strong iron dowel running up into it, and this did not seem to have rusted in the least. At any rate, all the other figures were still quite firm. Now, Harry Cave was so anxious to see the destruction of the tomb that the clerk of the works made no objection to putting it off for a week or two, as the men had plenty to do in other parts of the building. So Harry spent a few days in bed, and another few in comparative quiet for him, interrupted only by somewhat acrid disputes with his sister about the advisability of persisting in the design of the mourning chapel. Pugin and Green were quoted on one side, Mrs. Lenthal and sentimental considerations on the other, and Harry usually came away with flying colours, and these little battles aided him greatly in recovering his strength. It wanted now only 2 days to the time when he'd been told he might go to work again, and he was in great spirits at dinner, and I grieve to say he was offensively exultant towards his sister. Bedtime arrived. Harry went to bed, but he did not go to sleep immediately after blowing out his candle. The room was rather light, only a blind being drawn over the window, and he was feeling restless. But he turned his face to the wall and composed himself by reflecting upon the improvements in ritual which he wished to see introduced at Burford. Suddenly, he began to hear a faint sweeping or rustling noise approaching over the carpet. He turned half over. Nothing to be seen. The room being, as I said, fairly light by reason of the strong moonlight outside. It came now to the side of the bed. Then a pause, and next a very slight stretching of the bedclothes over his legs towards the outside of the bed, much as if a kitten had just jumped up on it. Harry was not much affected by this, but he was on the alert. The next phenomenon was the touch on the bare back of his neck of something bristly, so much so that it prickled the skin. Now, at that, he whipped over in bed, thoroughly frightened now, and had just time to see a very strange object against the white window blind before it disappeared. It was long and sharply crooked in the midst. He can only describe it by saying that it was like a very long finger covered thickly with short hairs. He was out of bed in a second, had a candle lighted, and searched the room thoroughly. But the door was fastened and the window shut. There was no sign of man or beast in any corner. For the rest of that night, Harry read the tracts for the Times. He kept the experience to himself the next day, feeling dimly that it was a point in favour of his sister's view. I mean, he could hardly tell why or how he came to connect it with the Lenthal's tomb, but that he did so connect it, he couldn't deny. He went down to the church in the morning and had a talk with the mason about tomorrow's job. The mason showed him the rope ready, attached to the pillar of the canopy, and he pointed out that the fall of the heavy marble transoms would so effectively break up the speaker that Miss Mary could construct a rockery from his remains. Now, that was exactly to Harry's taste, and he retailed the saying at luncheon. Mary was really very nearly reduced to tears over the matter. Mr. Cave chaffed her good-naturedly, but he was a little sorry for himself. Mr. Green, who arrived that day, was suave and instructive, but distinctly triumphant. Miss Cave had spent the evening in cleaning up the portrait of Speaker Lenthal, which old Mrs. Lenthal had presented to her on the day when she'd visited her for the last time. The gentlemen were in their rooms by 11 o'clock p.m. Now, it's fortunate for Harry Cave that his father sat up late in his bedroom that evening. Otherwise, he would never have heard the choking and crowing sound rising into a scream which came from Harry's. And at that point in the manuscript, a page is missing. It continues with these words: bedclothes, and then straight upon that, 2 sharp points had been plunged into his neck. He had cried out and clutched with his hands at the spot, only to feel something hairy, which pricked his fingers and seemed to melt away under them. The room, searched as strictly as possible, yielded no evidence whatever. But this adventure daunted Harry so completely, it became clear that he was now as much frightened at the thought of destroying Lenthal's tomb as he had been eager to do it. The scheme was dropped, and Miss Cave triumphed. She bore it well. At the moment when Harry detailed to her the circumstances of his adventure, she was engaged in cleaning the lower half of the Lenthal portrait. Suddenly she started. Ooh, what in the world is this on the table in the picture? Why, it's an enormous spider. And it was. Painted there, no doubt, as an emblem of industry, or avarice, or both. And that's all that survives of Speaker Lenthal's tomb. More complete than the others I read a month ago. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Next Friday, or anyway, the next, it's on the 31st of July, is the next Patreon exclusive, written by a friend of M.R. James and a kind of a protege in a way, Richard Malden. And it's a rather good story called Between Sunset and Moonrise. sat on the fens. Anyway, I hope that worked. As you know, I've been having trouble with my internet. Anyway, see you soon.